So I think it says in my biography in the program that I began, was interested in Islam and Arabic because when I did my junior year abroad as an undergraduate, I studied in Bonn and lived in a dormitory with a number of other Arab students. But actually listening to Dr. Musawi talk about the Arabian Nights, it reminded me that when I was in 6th grade, actually one week I had chicken pox and stayed at home. And I had one of those children's library editions of the Arabian Nights. It was about 200 pages long. And I read it once a day for the entire week that I was home with chicken pox. So maybe this planted some earlier seed of interest in the region. There's a certain poignancy for me today in being here and speaking about Duncan Black Macdonald in the Duncan Black Macdonald Center for the Study of Islam and Muslim-Christian Relations. I came back yesterday from Chicago where I had gone for a memorial service actually for a professor of mine, Farouk Abdul Wahab, who died in April, who taught Arabic language but also Arabic literature. He was a prolific translator of works from Arabic into English and also worked on Egyptian theater. And he had a very active career in Egyptian theater and cultural criticism in Cairo until he was blacklisted in 1967 and came to the United States. And it was very moving to be back in Chicago with old friends who had studied with Farouk and like me had come back to Chicago. And drawn back there really by the love that we felt for our teacher. We were drawn together by him. We had a community based on love for one another that sprang from the love that he had for us and the love that he had for the material that he taught us. And there's talk now of a memorial for Farouk. And I was thinking as I was in Chicago about, what would happen? When people see this plaque 50 years from now, will they really think about the man that it was for and these bonds of love that drew people together to create this? And being here at the Duncan Black Macdonald Center, I have to think too of this kind of towering figure that the seminary is named after, and I have to think too of the students that he taught, the bonds that he created, and those bonds of love that led to the naming of the center for him, and that bringing people together here for this enterprise that he cared so much about. And so in thinking about him and my professor, there's a certain I guess as I said poignancy to thinking about that today. I first read Duncan Black Macdonald's early study of Ghazali, and I'll be talking, I should say that I'm a scholar of Ghazali, and some of Duncan Black Macdonald's work, and that also his students, was about Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. He was a Persian thinker who wrote largely in Arabic. This was the shared language of the Islamic world at the time, and remains today the scholar of the language of religious scholarship. A towering figure of the status of an Augustine or Aquinas in the Muslim world, and some of the very first studies of this in the English language were by Duncan Black Macdonald. And I first read Macdonald's study of Ghazali 15 years ago when I was beginning my dissertation research. I still hadn't gone through the process of orienting myself in the scholarship on Ghazali, and without a more substantial criterion for selecting articles relevant to my research, I began more or less at the beginning at least, of English language scholarship on Ghazali. This meant tracking down volume 20, issue 1 of the Journal of the American Oriental Society from 1899, and in Macdonald's The Life of al-Ghazali with special reference to his religious experiences and opinions. Out of my ignorance, I was approaching Ghazali largely as a beginner, and so in his own way was Macdonald. He was able to see al-Ghazali with the eyes of a beginner, rather than through the lens, or sometimes fog, of the century of scholarship I later read. This scholarly legacy of the past century has raised certain facets of his life and thought to prominence as pieces of the accepted image of al-Ghazali, offering answers to questions deemed appropriate to be asked about him. Other facets of his life and thought that do not fit this picture have been deemed irrelevant. Macdonald's pioneering study contains elements of each of these categories. Certainly, he helped to shape the orthodox view of the meaning of Ghazali in Western scholarship, but as this view took shape in subsequent years, many of the possibilities inherent in his work were winnowed out and forgotten. Today, we are in the midst of a major re-evaluation of al-Ghazali, and with it a reopening of the question of which aspects of his life and thought are significant. It is striking to see that many of the new directions in al-Ghazali studies anticipated, that many of the new directions being taken today in al-Ghazali studies were anticipated by Macdonald's 1899 study, and hence the title of my talk, Paths Not Taken. In order to give a sense for the possibilities for understanding al-Ghazali found in Macdonald's pioneering work that were lost in subsequent scholarship, it's worth giving a summary of what we might call the standard model for al-Ghazali's life and thought that had coalesced by the 1950s and is still prevalent today outside the circle of Ghazali scholars. The standard model draws mainly on a short work by al-Ghazali written 5 years before his death called The Deliverer from Error. It presents itself as a work of spiritual autobiography and was accepted by an enthusiastic Western audience, which included not only Orientalists, but also William James, who seems to have learned about Ghazali and his work from Macdonald, and reproduced a lengthy excerpt from The Deliverer from Error in his variety of religious experiences. And from there it enjoyed a wider fame, coming to the attention of Evelyn Underhill and others. Al-Ghazali frames, and that's not to imply that Macdonald translated The Deliverer himself. He didn't. Actually, having read about Ghazali in Macdonald, it seems that William James translated the translation by Schmollers from French then into English. Al-Ghazali frames his life in The Deliverance almost entirely in terms of his intellectual and spiritual trajectory. There is little mention of people or life events influencing his progress. His extensive connections to the ruling Seljuk regime of his day find no mention. He begins The Deliverer by telling of his innate desire, already as a child, to know the true nature of things, which led him to question his own assumptions to such a degree that he lapsed into a radical skepticism that led him unable to make even the most basic judgments. Emerging from this state, not from his own efforts, but by a light that God had cast into his breast, he set about seeking a criterion for certain knowledge, concluding that if it was to be found, it must be possessed by one of four schools of thought: theology, philosophy, Ismaili Shiism, or Sufism. He writes of examining each of these in turn, composing refutations of Ismaili Shiism and devoting particular attention to philosophy, writing both a preparatory study of its key doctrines and a refutation of them. It was in Sufism that he found what he was seeking. But having achieved the intellectual conviction that Sufism held the key to certain knowledge, al-Ghazali found it impossible to bring himself to take up the rigorous ascetic practice that the Sufi path demands. And since we talked earlier about Macdonald's sort of attraction to mysticism as possibly a common ground for Christianity and Islam, and you can see then why a figure like Ghazali in particular would appeal to him. Al-Ghazali's inability to put theory into practice precipitated a spiritual crisis that forced his hand. Unable to speak, he could no longer fulfill his duties as a professor at the Nizamiya Madrasa in Baghdad. Unable to digest food, his doctors despaired of his very survival. But al-Ghazali understood that God had brought this crisis upon him to force him to act. Under the guise of traveling to Mecca to go on pilgrimage, he stole away to immerse himself in solitary spiritual exercises. In Montgomery Watt's iconic translation, he writes, "In due course I entered Damascus. There I remained for nearly 2 years, with no other occupation than the cultivation of retirement and solitude, together with religious and ascetic exercises. I used to go into retreat for a period in the Mosque of Damascus, going up the minaret of the mosque for a whole day and shutting myself in so as to be alone. After 2 years, he writes, his young children called him out of his seclusion and back to his home city of Tufts in the northeastern Iranian region of Khorasan, where his spiritual regime continued, though sporadically. 11 years after entering into a solitary spiritual life, he felt called by the spiritual malaise of his age and the explicit summons of the ruler to return to public life and share the fruits of his labors. We know from other biographical sources that he retired again some 3 years later and died in 1111. The influence of The Deliverer from Error on the prevailing understanding of al-Ghazali cannot be overstated. So beloved is this short work in the English-speaking world that it has been translated no fewer than 5 times into English. And among, certainly I think there are more translations of the 1001 Nights, and certainly the Quran has been translated more times than this. But I think that for works of Islamic religious sciences, this must be a record. It's been the main or even sole source for overviews of his life and thought and selections in anthologies. From it has emerged a general image of al-Ghazali as a solitary seeker whose spiritual motives were unsullied by worldly aims or even worldly connections. This image is best seen in the 2004 Deliverer-based film about al-Ghazali, The Alchemist of Happiness, in which his years of wandering are portrayed by a single man trekking through the desert with a pack animal. The intellectual arc al-Ghazali describes through the four schools of thought in search of a criterion for certain knowledge, as echoed most strongly in the mid-20th century studies of Montgomery Watt. His 1963 Muslim Intellectual, A Study of al-Ghazali, took theology, philosophy, Ismaili Shiism, and Sufism to be not only the basis for understanding the thought of al-Ghazali, but for the intellectual landscape of his entire age, understood through the prism of the sociology of knowledge. Accepting the account of the Deliverer at face value, some historians of Islamic thought, including not a few Muslims, charged al-Ghazali with bringing about the demise of philosophy in the Islamic civilization, and thereby allowing a still philosophizing European civilization to develop the scientific method and eclipse it several centuries later. And my teacher, Farouk, was somebody who held this conviction. He was at Chicago, the Ibn Rushd professorial lecturer of Arabic, and used to tell me that if my guy had won instead of your guy, then we would have gotten modernity and so on. Ibn Rushd being a famous critic of al-Ghazali. Finally, a particular canon of Ghazali's works emerged from this, focusing mainly on the Deliverer, short works of spiritual advice, and his critique of philosophy, the incoherence of the philosophers. His magnum opus, the 40-volume revival of the religious sciences, that he set to work on immediately after his departure from Baghdad, and which represents his new religious vision, was acknowledged as a masterpiece, but left largely unread and presumed to be an orthodox work of Sufism. Over the past 2 decades, the standard model has begun to change. The emerging picture of al-Ghazali shows that, far from having rejected philosophy, his work can largely be understood to be an appropriation of many of the key tenets of the philosophical system of Ibn Sina. What he presents in his revival of the religious sciences is not Sufism, orthodox or otherwise, but a discipline of his own invention, the science of the hereafter, which does draw on Sufism, but philosophy as well. Far from an inward-directed solitary seeker, the author of the revival was engaged in the world around him in an attempt to revive a religious tradition the title of his work implies is dead. The Deliverer from Error, far from a transparent account of al-Ghazali's life and intellectual development, was an effort to deny the very real connection of his thought to the philosophical tradition in the face of enemies who accused him of precisely this, of having been influenced too much by philosophy. This new picture emerges out of new approaches to canon and method. Scholars like Frank Griffel and Afifi Al-Akiti have expanded the Western Ghazali canon, bringing hitherto unidentified writings to light, and rereading and reassessing works previously deemed inauthentic. In particular, his book, the book of To Be Withheld from Those Not Worthy of It. New insights have been reached by scholars like Yahya Michaud, and new findings confirmed by considering the assessment of medieval Muslim scholars of his thought, Ibn Taymiyyah in particular. My own work places the revival of the religious sciences at the center of Ghazali's thought and seeks to return the wandering mystic to his social and political networks. And in my rereading of Macdonald's work, it seems to me that all of these moves are anticipated some way in his 1899 essay. Now, Macdonald was no less enchanted by the Deliverer from Error than other Western scholars have been ever since its discovery by the West. He begins his article with a biography of Ghazali drawn from the Deliverer. But unlike many of his successors, he does not stop there. The list of works by Ghazali that he consulted for the article in the late 19th century is impressive. He cites al-Ghazali's commentary on the 99 Names of God, a work that has received little subsequent attention until Richard Frank focused on its Avicennan content nearly a century later. He read al-Ghazali's defense of allegory of the pens in book 35 of the revival, his composition on the critiques of the revival, which brought this important passage on Ghazali's cosmology to his attention, as well as the controversy it caused in Ghazali's own day. As a result, the image of the orthodox al-Ghazali that is so much a part of the standard model is undermined in Macdonald's account. Macdonald also read the book To Be Withheld from Those Not Worthy of It, one of al-Ghazali's most frankly philosophical works. Macdonald's focus on the revival is also ahead of its time. He published the first translation in English of any part of that work, the Book of Music and Singing, in 1901-02, which shows his strong emphasis on the emotional side of Ghazali's religious vision. No doubt influenced by this, later students of al-Ghazali here at the Hartford Theological Seminary undertook the first translations of two of the most important books of the revival as dissertations. The first book of the revival, the Book of Knowledge, was translated in 1940 by W. McCall, and the 21st book, which serves as an introduction to the second half of the revival, the Book of the Marvels of the Heart, was transferred by Skelly in 1938. This is not to say that Macdonald drew the same conclusion from these works as contemporary scholars have. His reading of the book to be withheld, in fact, draws the opposite conclusion from that of Al-Akiti, for whom it becomes Exhibit A in the case for the Avicennic influence on al-Ghazali. In response to those who charge that al-Ghazali held an esoteric doctrine not shared in his more popular works, Macdonald writes that, having read the book to be withheld, he found no evidence of this. Nor did he find, in the commentary of the 99 Names, the evidence Richard Frank did for Avicennic influence. I don't want to exaggerate Macdonald's prescient insight. Without the benefit of interceding generations, things that seem clear to us today did not seem clear to Macdonald. Still, his openness to these books, some of which, like the book to be withheld, were dismissed by Montgomery Watt as forgeries, is remarkable. The main source for that Macdonald turns to for Ghazali's life and thought after the Deliverer is the 18th century commentary on the revival by al-Murtada Zabidi, who died in 1790. And in it, he combined the opinions of many great Muslim scholars on Ghazali, such as Ibn Rushd, Ibn Tufayl, and others. The result is a more multivalent picture of Ghazali that gives voices to his opponents and points to elements of his thought, again mainly philosophical influence, that were not taken seriously until recently. Macdonald ultimately rejects these charges of philosophical influence, but the fact that he gave voice to them entered them into the record rather than sweeping them under the carpet. The same can be said of Macdonald's treatment of legends that sprang up around Ghazali after his death. He was interested not only in the historical truth about Ghazali's life, but in al-Ghazali as a figure in the popular Muslim imagination and in his reception. This summer I'm returning to an issue I dealt with in my dissertation, namely controversies over al-Ghazali in the Maghreb and al-Andalus, that is in the Muslim West, the Islamic West. His revival was burned there in 1106, and he was invoked both by the Almoravid regime that ordered the burning of the book, and also by the Almohad regime that overthrew the Almoravids to legitimate their rule. Macdonald recounts several legends circulated by these regimes. So, for example, he finds in Zabidi an account that when Ghazali died, he told people, well, you know, I'm going to die. Some of the people to my funeral, but don't wash my body. That will be taken care of. And then three mysterious figures emerge. They wash the body, preside over the funeral and bury it, and then disappear. And then it's later learned by a hatif, a sort of disembodied voice, that these were members of the Sanhaja tribe. That is to say, that the tribe in southern Morocco from which the Almoravid regime sprang. And then it's also said that the founder of the Almohad regime that overthrew them, Ibn Tumart, was present with Ghazali when he heard that his revival of the religious sciences had been burned in Muslim Spain, and that Ghazali entrusted Ibn Tumart with taking his revenge on the Almoravids. Now, both of these are legends, and again, a more sort of positivist historian might have simply, left them aside, but Macdonald saw their importance and included them in his account. Macdonald also sees the role of worldly politics in the life of Ghazali, suggesting that his return to teaching in 1106 may have been due to the death in the previous year of the Seljuk Sultan Barkyok, whose opponent, Tutush, Ghazali had backed in 1095. He implies then that the period that Ghazali's period of retirement was motivated not only by the internal spiritual quest, but also by having backed the wrong horse in the succession struggle following the death of Malik Shah in 1092. Another element of worldliness Macdonald reinserts into Ghazali's biography is one that I emphasize in my own biography of Ghazali. As I mentioned, al-Ghazali's years of spiritual quest are often presented as years of solitary wandering. I was therefore excited to learn in his letters that throughout these years he was accompanied by a longtime friend and fellow student of al-Jawrani, one Ibrahim Sabah from Georgetown. I had found this in Dorothea Kowalski's commentary on her 1970 German translation of the collection of al-Ghazali's Persian letters. And I was very pleased with myself and to put something that seemed unique into Ghazali's biography. So in the past few months in rereading Macdonald, I was quite surprised to find that Macdonald had alluded to the same figure 70 years before Dorothea Kowalski calling him Ibrahim Shibaki, so a slight difference in the name, and that he had found this character in the Ghazali biography of Sam'ani, as well as in the revival commentary of Al-Murtada Zabidi. And I had read some of the same sources and not picked up on that detail. So anyway, again, it is impressive that Macdonald in these points anticipates directions taken in al-Ghazali's scholarship a century after his work. We can see in his encounter with his religious other that Duncan Black Macdonald did not lose sight of his own tradition. And I should say, after the earlier talk, that at least in this essay that he wrote about Ghazali, much of what he has to say about the Islamic tradition falls in this column and not in that column. He takes a very ecumenical approach to the religion, and I didn't see any of the kinds of this other side of Duncan Macdonald and his relationship to Islam. So, in the writings of other Christian scholars of Islam, we find a pronounced Christian aversion to a religious legal tradition, whether Jewish or Muslim. While Macdonald may not have emphasized al-Ghazali's seminal contributions to Islamic jurisprudence, he did see the role that the law plays in the spirituality of the revival, and writes of al-Ghazali's role in balancing the mystical with the legal and logical, which is perceptive, even if more secularly positioned scholars today might not use the same language that he did. Macdonald's specifically Protestant aversion to scholasticism attuned him to al-Ghazali's critique of the Kalam tradition of theology. He seems to see a Protestant fellow traveler in al-Ghazali when he writes, "What happened in Europe when the yoke of medieval scholasticism was broken, what is happening to us now, happened in Islam under his leadership. He could be a scholastic with scholastics, but to state and develop theological doctrine on a scriptural basis was emphatically his method. We should call him today a biblical theologian." I can't agree with Macdonald's conclusion here, and neither would most of Ghazali's Muslim readers, who from the beginning have criticized him for his use of weak hadith in particular. But it is striking to think that Macdonald's admiration for al-Ghazali for his sola scriptura approach to religious thought was an admiration for his adherence to Muslim scripture, Quran and hadith, implying a respect for a scripture not his own. Of course, we saw in the earlier presentation that in other moods al-Ghazali could approach Muslim scripture very differently. Here, at least, he seems to appreciate al-Ghazali's relationship to Islamic scripture as Islamic scripture, and any kind of missionary impulse seems to have been repressed in this case. The Italian Jesuit scholar Vincenzo Poggi has noticed the preponderance of Christian clergy among Ghazali scholars. And if we look at some of their writings, we see how restrained Macdonald was in imposing a Christian framework on Ghazali's thought. A Western Christianized reading of the Deliverer and on al-Ghazali's thought more broadly is most plainly found in the Spanish Jesuit Asim Palacios' Al-Ghazali su Sentido Cristiano, or in the Protestant clergyman Samuel Svemmer's A Muslim Seeker After God, showing Islam at its best in the life and teaching of al-Ghazali, mystic and theologian of the 11th century, in which the author writes, "There is a real sense in which al-Ghazali may be used as a schoolmaster to lead Muslims to Christ." A Christian reading is more subtly at work in the deliberate mistranslation of the title of the Deliverer by Montgomery Watt, a priest of the Scottish Episcopal Church. He rendered al-Muqtadam al-Dalal, whose title Macdonald leaves untranslated, as the deliverance from error rather than the deliverer, thereby casting that work as an account of his author's passive deliverance by God. This mistranslation was adopted by this Jesuit translator of the Deliverer, R.G. McCarthy, as well as by Muhammad Abu-Layla, whose 2002 translation of the Deliverer was published by the Council for Research in Values and Philosophy, housed in the Catholic University of America. It suggests a purely personal concern with salvation and casts al-Ghazali as an Augustine figure, a parallel made plainer in the title of the first English translation of the Deliverer by Claude Field in 1909, The Confessions of al-Ghazali, again, The Confessions of al-Ghazali, Rescuer from Error. For all of Macdonald's admiration for Ghazali, and for all that he saw mystics as common ground between Christianity and Islam, he avoided the pitfalls of this, of over-Christianizing al-Ghazali in his study of Ghazali. To conclude, I'm very much struck by Macdonald's open-mindedness in his approach to Ghazali in his work and to the Islamic tradition. And to think about the earlier talk we read today, it still strikes me that the fact that other attitudes come out in his work should come as no surprise. And I wouldn't necessarily expect to see a development over time, because this kind of work, being rooted in your own tradition and trying to appreciate another is a very hard one, as I'm sure people here at the seminary realize. There are times when you approach the thought of somebody rooted in another tradition in a very expansive mood, and you can see its beauty and its genius, and to some extent enter into its mindset, as Duncan Macdonald said. But there are times when even this then can be a shock and can lead to a kind of disorientation and an uncertainty about your relationship to your own tradition. There are other times when reading a work rooted in another tradition that you can be put off by something in it, or in an encounter with a representative of another tradition, and not necessarily a religious tradition, a cultural tradition, somebody speaking another language that you could find in a front, real or imagined there. And again, this can often throw you into the kind of mindset that some of Macdonald's writings reveal that he fell prey to at times. But I think, too, that if we want to think about Duncan Macdonald as a man of his times, even if he may sometimes have been ahead of his times or before his time, we also have to think of ourselves as rooted in our particular tradition, in our particular time. And if, 100 years from now, somebody sits down and talks about the Ghazali tradition of the early 21st century, what will their predilections be? What will their worldview be? And how will they find that our attitudes today have offended it in some way? If you look at the way that Ghazali is presented today, there is a real emphasis in some of the scholarship that I mentioned here on him standing, astride different traditions within the Islamic tradition. Ibrahim Musa, in his book on Ghazali, seizes on a word that he uses at one point in The Deliverer from Error, dignities or thresholds. And he talks about him as a Dionysian figure, a figure that stands at the threshold of different currents in Islamic thought, philosophy, theology, mysticism, the law, and so on, and still doesn't belong to any one of them. And that the different truth claims of these different sort of sub-traditions, the different methods and maybe irreconcilable worldviews of them are ones that he accepted as irreconcilable and was able to straddle them all. This is something that we find very appealing today. It seems, again, like a very ecumenical approach to Ghazali, a very ecumenical approach to the numerous sub-traditions that exist in any other human tradition. But again, this is something that grows out of our own time, and we have to wonder too if someday this, what Duncan Macdonald would have thought of us in the scholarship that we're doing, and what future generations will think about us, even as we stand in judgment over the work of a person who wrote 100 years ago.